The Price of Standing Tall, Houston 1917. The Weight of Uniform and Injustice. The barracks at Camp Logan existed in a state of perpetual tension, a place where the United States Army's commitment to military discipline collided violently with the nation's deeply entrenched system of racial segregation. It was August 1917, and the world was at war, but the war being fought in the streets of Houston, Texas was different. It was a war against humanity itself, waged with the weapons of Jim Crow laws and white supremacy. Private James Washington stood at attention outside the barracks, his uniform pristine despite the oppressive heat that made sweat bead on his dark skin and stain the fabric beneath his arms. He was 23 years old, from Atlanta, Georgia, where he had learned from childhood that certain rules governed his existence, rules that seemed to have nothing to do with law and everything to do with the color of his skin. He had joined the 24th Infantry Regiment believing that military service offered something different. He had believed that when he put on the uniform of the United States Army, he would become something more than the limitations his country placed on him. He had believed, with the naive hope of a young man, that patriotism could transcend racism. That belief was being tested in ways he had never imagined. The 24th Infantry was an all-black regiment, one of the oldest African-American military units in American history. These were soldiers who had fought in the Spanish-American War, who had served with distinction in the Philippines, who carried a legacy of martial excellence that was both a source of pride and a constant target of resentment from white civilians and even some white officers. But camp life at Houston exposed them daily to the reality that a uniform didn't change skin color, and skin color was what mattered in Texas in 1917. The segregation began the moment the regiment arrived. Black soldiers were not allowed to eat in certain restaurants. They were not allowed to use certain water fountains. They were forced to sit in the back of streetcars, behind a line drawn by Jim Crow law that might as well have been drawn in blood. And most humiliating, most degrading, they were regularly subjected to verbal abuse, to being called names that reduced them from soldiers to something less than human. Private Charles Baltimore had learned this lesson more violently than most. Baltimore was a seasoned soldier, a man who had served with the 24th Infantry for years, who carried himself with the dignity of someone who understood his own worth regardless of what society tried to tell him. On August 23, he had been walking through Houston in civilian clothes, something every soldier was permitted to do during off-duty hours. But his civilian clothes didn't change the color of his skin, and when he encountered a white police officer named Racism Lee, the confrontation that followed revealed the true hierarchy of power in Houston. According to multiple accounts, Baltimore had been accused of something trivial, perhaps stepping on a white woman's foot, perhaps speaking out of turn. The exact details mattered less than the principle. A black man had violated the invisible protocols of racial submission, and punishment was required. Racism Lee arrested Baltimore and beat him brutally, his nightstick falling again and again on the soldier's body. Other white police officers joined in, creating a tableau of state-sanctioned violence that would have been unremarkable in many parts of America, just another black man being taught his place. But Baltimore was a soldier. And the men he served with had watched him being dragged away. By the time he was released that evening, bearing bruises that told the story of his encounter with Houston Justice, every soldier in the 24th Infantry knew what had happened. Private Washington had been in the barracks when Baltimore returned. He had seen the bruises. He had heard the quiet rage in the other soldiers' voices. And he had felt something dangerous beginning to build in his own chest, a pressure that threatened to shatter the careful equilibrium he had maintained, the psychological balance required to live in a system designed to humiliate you daily while you were expected to smile and accept it. "They can't do this," someone said quietly in the barracks that evening. "They already did," another voice replied. "They do it every day. But we are soldiers. We have rights." "We have nothing," an older soldier interrupted. "We have uniforms and we have rifles and we have discipline. But we don't have rights. Not here. Not in Texas." Washington lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the verses his mother had taught him from the Bible, verses she had repeated to him since childhood as a kind of spiritual armor against the world's hatred. She had taught him about David and Goliath, about standing against injustice even when you stood alone. She had taught him about the book of Exodus, about slavery and liberation, about a God who saw the oppressed and heard their cries. But what good were verses when the system was too large, too powerful, too deeply embedded in the very foundation of American society? What good was faith when the world seemed determined to crush it out of you? He didn't know that he was about to find out. August 23, 1917, the night that would change everything, began with rumors. The rumor was that Baltimore had been killed. The rumor was specific, detailed, and completely false, but it spread through the barracks like a match dropped into kindling. By late evening, nearly every black soldier in the regiment had heard that one of their own had been murdered by Houston police. The truth was more complicated. Baltimore, after his beating, had been released. He was alive. But the rumor of his death served a different purpose. It was the spark that ignited the pressure that had been building for weeks, months, the pressure created by daily humiliation, daily dehumanization, daily reminders that the uniform meant nothing against the color of their skin. Around midnight, someone, history has never quite identified who, said the words that transformed a gathering of angry men into something else entirely. We should go into the city. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a formal order. It was simply a suggestion that crystallized what had been implicit for weeks, that there was a limit to what even disciplined soldiers could endure, and that limit had been reached. Private Washington found himself part of a movement that seemed to take on its own momentum. Nearly 200 soldiers began assembling weapons. There was no formal chain of command directing this. There was no clear objective, no strategy that extended beyond a vague intention to confront the police officers who had beaten Baltimore, to demand justice, to assert their dignity even if it meant violating every military regulation. Washington knew this was wrong. He knew it was insubordination, mutiny even. He knew it would end in disaster. But he also knew that the pressure in his chest had to go somewhere, that the accumulated humiliations and degradations couldn't be contained anymore, that something, some force that was greater than logic or fear, was driving him toward the city streets along with his brothers in arms. Subscribe to hear the complete story of resistance and consequence. This is a narrative about the true cost of standing against systemic injustice. Don't miss what happens next. The march into Houston began around midnight. 200 black soldiers, carrying rifles and ammunition, moving through the darkness with the kind of organized purpose that suggested they were no longer simply soldiers responding to rumors. They had become something else, a force of resistance, an army of men who had collectively decided that their dignity was worth the risk. They moved through the black neighborhoods of Houston, and something strange happened. The community responded. It was as if the soldiers were embodying something that had been waiting to happen, something that had been building in the black community for generations. People came out of their homes. Some followed the soldiers. Some offered encouragement. It was, in a way, a moment of collective uprising against a system that had seemed immutable and unchangeable. But the soldiers were not marauding. They were not looting or burning randomly. Instead, they seemed focused on finding police officers, on confronting them, on demanding accountability. It was a form of resistance that was almost disciplined in its nature, soldiers attempting to use military organization against a system of oppression. The violence, when it came, was almost inevitable. Confrontations with white police officers and white citizens turned into gunfire. In the chaos of the night, approximately 20 people died, mostly white citizens and police officers, but also some soldiers. The exact numbers were never clearly established, because Houston's white authorities had every incentive to inflate the casualty figures and to characterize the entire event as a riot rather than what it was, an uprising by oppressed men who had reached their breaking point. By dawn, the soldiers had withdrawn from the city. They had returned to camp. But the damage, not to property, but to the social order, had been done. Proof had been offered to Houston's white establishment that black soldiers were willing to use violence to assert their rights, and that was something that could not be tolerated. The military response was swift and terrifying in its scope. The Army court-martial proceedings began almost immediately. 63 soldiers were arrested and charged with mutiny and murder. The trials were conducted with what might charitably be called unseemly haste. Soldiers were given minimal defense, minimal opportunity to present their version of events, and minimal chance of acquittal in a military justice system that seemed predisposed to conviction. Private Washington was among those charged. He had been in the march. He had carried a rifle. He had been part of the collective action. That was enough, in the eyes of the military court, to make him guilty of whatever the prosecution suggested he was guilty of. The trial transcripts, preserved in military archives, reveal a system of justice that barely deserves the name. Witnesses were often unnamed or identified only by initials. Evidence was thin or non-existent for many of the accused. The prosecution's strategy was simple: these were black soldiers who had risen against authority, and they needed to be punished in a way that would make clear that such resistance was impossible. Washington sat in the military courtroom, listening to testimony that bore almost no relation to his actual activities that night. He had not personally killed anyone. He was not even certain he had fired his weapon, given the chaos and darkness and confusion. But the distinction seemed irrelevant to the proceedings. He was black. He was in the march. Therefore, he was guilty. His appointed military attorney offered a defense that was perfunctory at best. The lawyer seemed to understand, perhaps better than Washington himself, that the outcome was predetermined. The best that could be hoped for was that the sentence might be something less than execution. It was not. On December 11, 1917, Private James Washington was convicted of murder and mutiny. The sentence was death by firing squad. In his cell, waiting for execution, Washington experienced what might be described as a spiritual crisis. He had carried faith with him from his childhood, had believed in a God who saw injustice and responded to it. But the God he had believed in seemed distant now, seemed indifferent to what was happening in a military prison in Texas. He spent hours writing letters to his mother, letters to other soldiers awaiting execution, letters that were attempts to make sense of what was happening. In one letter, written the day before his execution, he addressed the question that must have been tormenting him. I have been condemned not for anything I did with my own hands, but for being in a place where my presence was deemed threatening to white superiority. I ask myself what God intends by this, and I find no answer that brings comfort. But I remember the psalm that speaks of the righteous crying out in the darkness, of God hearing the voice of the afflicted. I do not know if God hears. But I must believe that God sees. And if God sees, then even in this darkness, even in this injustice, I am not invisible. I am known. I am witnessed. And that must be enough. 13 soldiers were executed on December 11, 1917. 13 men, most of them young, all of them convicted in proceedings that barely qualified as trials, were led to a platform in front of a firing squad composed of other soldiers. The executions were carried out in secret, without public announcement, as if the army understood that what was happening was something shameful, something that needed to be hidden from public view. Private James Washington was among those executed. He faced the firing squad with a dignity that the witnesses, fellow soldiers forced to carry out the execution, would remember for the rest of their lives. He did not beg for mercy. He did not curse his fate. Instead, he stood at attention, like a soldier, and he seemed to be looking beyond the immediate moment, beyond the guns that were about to end his life, toward something that the men about to shoot him could not see. The bullets came. He fell. 13 black soldiers, in the span of a few hours, were executed by the United States Army. Like this video to honor the memory of soldiers who were executed for demanding their rights, these men deserve to be remembered, and their story deserves to be told. The Houston Mutiny, as it came to be known in military histories, was largely erased from American consciousness. For decades, it existed only in military archives, in documents that few people read, in historical records that were buried beneath other narratives. The general public, to the extent they knew about it at all, understood it as a riot, a moment when black soldiers had run amok, when they had needed to be disciplined, when the proper order of things had been restored through swift military justice. But in the black community, the Houston Mutiny was something different. It was a moment when men had stood up. It was a moment when the intolerable nature of Jim Crow had forced a confrontation. It was a moment when soldiers had decided, collectively, that their dignity was more important than their obedience. The executions haunted the military's conscience, if the military could be said to have won. In the years that followed, additional trials were conducted. More soldiers were convicted. More executions followed, though later executions were conducted with more secrecy, with more attempts to prevent public knowledge. By the end of the court-martial proceedings, 41 soldiers from the 24th Infantry had been executed, making it the largest mass execution in American military history. But the executions didn't accomplish what the military command hoped they would. Instead, they created martyrs. They created a historical record of injustice that would eventually be examined, questioned, and recognized for what it truly was, a tragedy born of a system that had degraded black soldiers so thoroughly that they had finally, collectively, broken. In 1938, nearly 21 years after the Houston events, President Franklin D. Roosevelt granted clemency to one of the soldiers who had been sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the march. The soldier, granted his release, became a living reminder that the system of military justice had been wrong, that the trials had been inadequate, that men had been condemned not for crimes but for their color and their desperate attempt to assert their humanity. Private Washington's body was buried in an unmarked grave. His execution was recorded in military documents, but his name disappeared from the historical record for many decades. It wasn't until the 1970s, when historians began examining the Houston Mutiny in detail, that the stories of individual soldiers began to emerge from the archives. Washington's letters were discovered and preserved. His final letter to his mother, written the night before his execution, became a powerful artifact, a document that spoke to the intersection of faith, injustice, and the human need to maintain dignity even when facing death. His mother, who lived for many years after her son's execution, never fully recovered from the loss. But she kept his memory alive, telling anyone who would listen about the soldier her son had been, about the injustice he had suffered, about the need to remember that African American men had been willing to die for their dignity long before it became fashionable to speak of civil rights. Decades later, in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, James Washington's story was rediscovered. He became a symbol, along with the other 13 men executed on December 11, 1917, of a long history of resistance. His name appeared in books. His letters were quoted. And his execution was recognized, finally, as what it was, a tragedy born of systematic injustice, a crime committed by a nation against men who had done nothing except demand to be treated as human beings. In 2008, the U.S. Army formally exonerated 3 of the 24th Infantry soldiers who had been executed in 1917. The exonerations came too late to restore their lives, came after decades of silence and forgetting. But they represented an acknowledgement, however belated, that the trials had been unjust, that the executions had been unlawful, and that the soldiers had been victims of a system designed to suppress their humanity. Private James Washington was not among those formally exonerated. His case, along with many others, remained technically unresolved in the official record, a bureaucratic silence that seemed almost as damning as the original injustice. But in the collective memory of the African American community, in the historical record that refused to allow the Houston Mutiny to be forgotten, Washington's name lived on. He became a symbol of something essential, the idea that human dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, that resistance to injustice carries a cost but is nonetheless necessary, and that men will sometimes choose to stand against overwhelming systems of oppression even knowing that the cost might be their lives. Comment below. How should we remember the soldiers who were executed for demanding their rights? This conversation about justice, memory, and the true cost of resistance is one we need to continue having. In churches, in schools, in history classes, the story of the Houston Mutiny began to be told again. Young people learned about Private James Washington, about the 13 men executed on December 11, 1917, about the system of military justice that had condemned them, about a nation that had sacrificed soldiers on the altar of racial supremacy. And as the story was told, a biblical verse that Washington had carried with him into his final hours seemed to gain new resonance. The Lord is near to those who are brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34 verse 18. Washington had believed that God saw the oppressed. He had believed that even in injustice, even in the face of a system designed to erase him, he was witnessed and known. That faith had sustained him through his trial, had given him dignity in his final moments. And perhaps, in a way that transcends the immediate tragedy of his death, his faith was vindicated. Because he was seen. He was remembered. His story was preserved and told. The injustice done to him and his brothers was eventually recognized and named as such. The firing squad that executed him had removed him from life, but they had not erased him from history. In death, he became something more powerful than he could have been in life, a symbol of resistance, a testament to human dignity, a reminder that some moments demand that we stand, regardless of the cost. When visitors to military museums encounter the exhibits about the Houston Mutiny, when students read the letters that Private Washington wrote, when historians examine the court-martial records and see how justice was perverted in the name of maintaining racial order, they are encountering something essential about American history. They are encountering the truth that freedom has always required sacrifice. They are encountering the reality that black soldiers have always been willing to pay the price for their dignity. And they are encountering the challenge that such history presents to us all. What will we do with this knowledge? How will we honor the memory of those who were executed? What changes do we need to make so that the Houston Mutiny is recognized not as an aberration but as a symptom of a disease that we are still working to cure? Private James Washington died on December 11, 1917, his body falling before a firing squad composed of other soldiers, his execution carried out in silence, his grave left unmarked. But in the decades and centuries that followed, his name would be spoken. His story would be told. And his death would stand as testimony to what the Bible promised, that the cry of the oppressed does not go unheard, that injustice does not have the final word, and that human dignity, ultimately, cannot be destroyed by any system, no matter how powerful it seems in the moment.